Thank you very much. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much for the introduction, David Rennie, and thanks to Kirk Kernet for allowing me to digitally be here with you all. I currently live in Shenzhen, which is an enormous city in mainland China bordering Hong Kong. And as much as I'd like to be there with you in person, in Sweden, country I very much love, there's something of a rub in flying on an airplane such great distances in order to deliver a eco-critical lecture. So I was actually thinking that incidentally, the train ride from Shenzhen to Hong Kong is not unlike the trip between Great Neck and New York City, which is going to be the subject of my paper today. This paper is very much a draft, which makes this conference perhaps the very best place to get some input, as I am not a scholar of Fitzgerald to the extent that I know many of the people in this room and at this conference are. So with that in mind, let us dive in. As was just mentioned, if you ride the Long Island Railroad from Penn Station towards Port Washington, you will inevitably pass through Queens. And for a window-gazing, literary-minded commuter, you no doubt either already know or would be interested to know that this is roughly the path traversed by Gatsby and the Buchanans some 100 years ago in The Great Gatsby. This is the part this is the description of the Valley of Ashes. This is the no man's land between Manhattan and Long Island. It's also known as Corona Dump, as Willets Point, and now it is called Flushing Meadows Corona Park, the site of the 1939 and the 1964 World's Fairs, and lately the US Open. Slipped strangely and hauntingly into the interstices of a book otherwise full of vibrant colors, shimmering dreams, and exquisite aristocratic parties, Fitzgerald's Valley of Ashes is described in sharp chiaroscuro to the upper class happenings that comprise the outward structure of the plot. So much ink has been spilled sussing out the various meanings of the Valley of Ashes, and I'll just quickly list a few here. One scholar, Robert Long, observes that the growing gardens of ash echo the idea of Flushing, Queens as a fallen Eden, noting that Fitzgerald went so far in manuscript editions of The Great Gatsby to call it the back alleyway of hell, which aligns the small foul river, so described, with the river Styx and the unfortunate men who move dimly and already crumbling with the shades of the dead. Fitzgerald was likely invoking Psalm 23:4, the valley of the shadow of death. Though the presence of God in Psalm 23 is not taken for granted in Fitzgerald's description, unless you're considering, of course, the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg. These hellish implications are strengthened by Fitzgerald's comparison to the river of Burness, which in classical literature was a sulfurous swamp rumored to be so poisonous to nature that birds couldn't fly over it without dropping dead from the sky. In other words, an eco-catastrophe. Robert Lehan connects the Valley of Ashes to Fitzgerald's greater project of representing the vacuousness of the new commercial culture of 1920s America. The lower classes who work in this barren industrial landscape are manual laborers, machinists, pump station attendants, represented by the character of George Wilson, an anemic, spiritless man who is representative of the unseen, overlooked, dehumanized working class, whose meager means of living is defined by the whims of the aristocrats, whose cars he fixes and refuels, and whose life is shaped by their extravagancies and ultimately destroyed by their carelessness. All right, Now we're going to get a little strange. I would like to propose reading Gatsby through an Anthropocene framework. What I mean by Anthropocene framework is to consider the Great Gatsby as a reflection of the current debates in the fields of geology and environmental science regarding the proper naming of our geologic epoch or age. So in this paper, I take it as a given that we live in a new geological time period, which is defined by the predominant force on this planet being human beings themselves. The main question in Anthropocene studies is a temporal one. Firstly, when did the Anthropocene begin? Secondly, what will be the material stuff that will remain as geological evidence of the human presence on this planet? And thirdly, what comes after the Anthropocene, or when will the Anthropocene end? What will replace us all eventually as the predominant geological force that shapes the face of the planet? Okay, so bear with me just a little bit here as we continue to think geologically. To define a time period in the field of geology, one turns to the subfield of stratigraphy. That is the study of layers of dirt and rock that make up previous ages, epochs, periods, eras, eons. According to the Anthropocene Working Group, as surely as we can trace the extinction of the dinosaurs to a thin line of iridium distributed evenly around the planet due to a catastrophic asteroid impact, so too will we be able to detect a human layer, a human stratum, a layer of human detritus which future geologists and archaeologists will be able to point to as evidence of us on this little blue planet. I propose a stratigraphic reading of Gatsby. In other words, a reading of Gatsby that pays attention to the material layers of time that are described within its pages, that pays attention to those descriptions in the novel when fictional time erupts into geological time. The line at which one layer of rock is chemically different enough from the second layer of rock on top of it to justify naming a new age or epoch or era is called a golden spike. And here, for example, you can see such a spike defining the Ediacaran period 96 million years ago. Geologists argue furiously about when or where these golden spikes ought to be placed in the geological record. And this is true for the Anthropocene too. Depending on where you think where you put this golden spike, where you think humans started really making a difference on the planet, there's been suggestions for putting the golden spike at the invention of the steam engine, or the Neolithic use of fire, or the agricultural revolution, or the detonation of a nuclear bomb. Arguments about who or what is responsible for the Anthropocene are often hinge upon where we put that golden spike, and have led to potential proposed culprits, generating names like you see on the screen here: Thermocene, Pyrocene, Thanatocene, ad nauseum. But since we're imposing the Anthropocene on to the Great Gatsby today, and you guys are being very kind to humor me, at the risk of being a little too punny, perhaps too cute, I suggest that instead of calling it a golden spike, let's indulge Fitzgerald and let's call it a gold-hatted, high-bouncing spike, with reference to the above reproduced epigraph. And that such a gold-hatted, high-bouncing spike for the Jazz Age might best be read into Fitzgerald's description of the Valley of Ashes. I propose we consider the Flapper scene, or the Jazzocene, or the Gatsby scene. So, returning to the Valley of Ashes, this is an aerial composite map of Manhattan and Queens from 1921. Stranger than fiction, Fitzgerald's Valley of Ashes was a real place. In 1925, one could follow Fitzgerald's description to an actual dump in Queens. In the 1920s, electricity was still a relatively new invention, and gas or oil heating had not yet replaced coal heating. This meant that the city of 5.5 million people all depended on coal to stay warm during the winters. To dispose of the mountains of ash generated from Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs, the city paid the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company to daily dump trainloads of garbage into a salt marsh on the outskirts of the city near an inlet to Flushing Bay, that is the Corona Ash Dump. And here we have one of the trains for delivering the ash. This train was known as the Talcum Powder Express, because despite efforts to cover these trains full of ash with tarps, huge clouds of smoke could be seen billowing from the tops of the dump cars, which carried some 90 cubic yards of ash per car twice per day to Corona Dump. In addition to dumping trash and garbage, the company engaged in the ecologically disastrous project of incinerating the trash, completely devastating the environment and fostering working conditions that could not have been anything but dangerous and unhealthful. The CEO of the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company was named John A. Fishhooks McCarthy. Fishhooks, quite the nickname. He seemed himself to be some sort of parody of a robber baron as he administered his business, described as sitting under a beach umbrella on an old rocking chair while he personally tallied each truckload of material as it arrived. One pile of trash, affectionately named Mount Corona, was 100 feet tall and was said to be home of rats big enough to wear saddles. McCarthy allowed scavengers to rummage through the trash for potential valuables among the detritus, and we can credit him with the creation of a miserable and exploitative business. He is the source of Fitzgerald's description of the inhabitants of the Valley of Ashes, those men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. And of course, the foul-smelling river that was Flushing Creek. So for all the imagination that inspired Fitzgerald's famous description of the Valley of Ashes, the fact of the matter is he was directly describing reality. His description of a capitalist wasteland, the inevitable ends of materialist greed, was not a dark prediction, was not just a dark prediction where he believed American consumer culture would ultimately lead. It was no mere symbol or omen. It was astoundingly real, a literal smoldering pit where fantasy is smashed by reality, product decomposes into garbage, life into death, fresh green breast of the new world wilts gray, the green light of hope fizzles out, no daisies grow, cash turns to ash, etc., etc. But what Fitzgerald didn't anticipate was the future of the Valley of Ashes. He could not have guessed that the Baron von Haussmann of the 20th century, also known as Robert Moses, who in the late 1930s had achieved a meteoric rise to power as a city planner, had not only read The Great Gatsby, but was also profoundly moved by the description of the Valley of Ashes, going so far as to say that Fitzgerald's description of the dump cannot be improved upon, even by those of us who knew not only its threatening and depressing outward appearance, but even its exact chemical and physical properties, its unsavory history, and the mountainous labors required to take it away. So what exactly did Moses mean by the chemical properties of fly ash? And here, I'm going to sidestep all the cultural and symbolic meanings of ash, ashes to ashes, Hesiod's Theogony, Sodom and Gomorrah. Fitzgerald does enough to riff off these many symbolic allusions. I'd like to instead just look at the ash as a chemical marker of the Anthropocene. So what Moses meant is what we now know about the properties of fly ash. And here I quote the National Resources Defense Council. It's a carcinogen. It does not go away. It does not decompose. It just mellows there in Queens forever. It's a forever material. For Robert Moses, Fitzgerald's novel was not only a critique of the city, but a direct challenge. And here I'm about to skip over so much stuff. To be brief, Robert Moses bulldozed the Valley of Ashes, and he covered it in a thin layer of topsoil. He planted some grass, and then he hosted the 1939 New York World's Fair, Come See the World of Tomorrow, so themed, on the site. Just a couple years later, the entire fair, the World of Tomorrow, would be demolished for the World War II effort. There's so much to say about this. There's so many historical ironies and resonances wrapped up in the 1939 World's Fair and the following 1964 World's Fair. But for today, I'm just going to stick to the materials and the geology. So, as I was saying, fly ash is a detectable sediment, a known marker, according to geologists, of the Anthropocene. So when we think of the golden spike or the gold-hatted spike to define the Anthropocene, or the Jazzocene or the Gatsby scene, we could very well turn to the Valley of Ashes, not simply as a symbolic or physical representation of the human epoch. Indeed, we can see the Valley of Ashes as a literal material, carcinogenic layer of industrial refuse that will forever be in Queens, well beyond the lifespan of our species. I keep returning to this image from the 2013 Baz Luhrmann film of The Great Gatsby, because it gets to my geological point. So you can see the image is very layered, because it's a landscape, of course. But let's look at it like a stratigrapher would. We can see the bottom layer there is green. It's the pastoral new world. That's the past. The middle layer is the industrial refuse of the Valley of Ashes. And then the top layer is the skyline of Manhattan, the present. If stratigraphers metaphorically read layers of rock like the pages of a book, what happens when we read Gatsby looking for the layers of rock? What ultimately do we find when we read the pages of Gatsby for the stratum or refuse that will remain? Fitzgerald, we might say, is an accidental geologist describing in the passages the very processes and landscapes that will be the ultimate evidence of his age, the Jazz Age, the Jazzocene. And seen from the temporal abyss of geology, illuminated by the light of Anthropocene studies, much of this novel's dark symbolism and scenery becomes even darker, even more tragic. And if I had more time, I would certainly connect many of these proposed Anthropocene variants to this landscape, particularly the Thermocene, the Pyrocene. There's much to be said about cars, of course, Phagocene, and more about consumerism, but that's for a longer paper. For the now, all I want to say, all of this is just to say, underlying the plot of The Great Gatsby, underlying all these symbolic events and descriptions, beneath just a few inches of topsoil, the ashes of decades worth of dumping still simmer in Flushing Meadows Corona Park. And even today, if you were to go out to Flushing Meadows Corona Park today, I know this is true because I've done it myself. You can dig up these ashes of the Jazzocene with a trowel. Thank you all for your time and for entertaining my stratigraphical reading of The Great Gatsby.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vander, and thanks to all of our presenters today. I think rather than sort of wasting time by relocating to the front, we'll just use our brief remaining time to take any questions that the audience might have at this point. Yes.
This question is for Evander. This is sort of a personal question, but your background I have seen before as a way to, tell future generations about nuclear waste and keep them out. I was wondering, one, is that actually correct, that information? And also, if so, is there a connection that you'd like to make between what we were talking about?
Yeah, you hit the ball out of the park right there. This is one of the proposals for creating a landscape of desolation meant to scare people away from digging. This is one of the ways of hiding nuclear waste underground and then signaling to future human beings that they shouldn't dig there for the obvious reasons of not wanting to poison future generations with nuclear waste. So yeah, I was just trying to, Valley of Ashes being a wasteland, of course, connected to T.S. Eliot's poem as well, bring the modern wastelands of nuclear waste or other toxic dumps as just a part of an overall geological Anthropocene theme. But yeah, good eye.
Thank you, Evander. I think we've got time for maybe one quick question. We all getting a little bit fatigued. Well, let's use our remaining seconds to give a hearty final round of applause and appreciation.
Oh.
Thank you, everybody. So, you still there, Evander? I think we did all right considering the distances involved. So well done. Congratulations.
Yeah. Was the sound coming through okay? That's the only thing I was concerned
you're
about.
perfectly clear all the way through.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't care if you guys know what I look like, but the words are important.